Today I would like to tell you about a fiery catastrophe in which an entire settlement disappeared. Before you watch this video, I'm going to ask you to support my channel with a thumbs up. It won't cost you anything, but it means a lot to me and my channel. Thank you. On September 20, 1980, a major catastrophe occurred in the suburbs of Syzran, the village of Mashinistov, during which an entire settlement was destroyed. Dozens of people died, hundreds were seriously burned and injured. On the night of September 20th, huge railroad tanks with liquefied gas were parked at Syzran 1 station, with a warning sign on them, "Do not go downhill." According to safety regulations, such containers were supposed to be transported only by shunting locomotives, but the dispatcher on duty ignored the instructions and gave the order to lower the tanks down the hill. The order came to the assistant train dispatcher, who, although subordinate to the dispatcher on duty, had the authority to independently evaluate and decide whether or not the tank could be lowered by gravity. The employee, having inspected the tanks with liquefied gas, proceeded to carry out the orders. The commission will find out later that similar actions have been performed by the officers on duty on the hill before. Flammable containers often went down by themselves. Multi-ton tank cars start moving. By a wicked irony, in a few minutes, oil buckets were lowered along this route, from which petroleum products spilled onto the rails and onto the car retarders, which are braking devices to reduce the speed of the carriages. The car retarders covered in fuel oil did not provide sufficient friction force, so that the 5 heavy tanks with liquefied gas did not slow down. On the contrary, their speed only began to increase and reached 40 kilometers per hour. The hump worker in charge of the speed of the incoming railroad units saw the tanks gaining unacceptable speed. He ran up and threw a brake shoe under the wheels, but by that time the speed of the tanks was too high. The tanks and the brake shoe kept moving. Wagons with cement were on their way. The worker had about 30 seconds to prevent a collision. In addition, he had 7 more brake shoes with which he could have tried to leave the moving containers, but the railroad worker, finding himself in a critical situation for the first time, was confused. He watched as the huge containers filled with liquid gas moved toward the standing cement cars. There was a bang. The tanks crashed into a cement car whose hitch punctured a tank of lethal liquefied gas. The gas gushed out in a powerful torrent. Even afterward, there was a chance of preventing a catastrophe. The worker would have immediately reported the accident to the duty officer and the fire department. The accident site would have been shut down. Nearby residents would have been warned not to light, smoke, or heat the stoves. After that, the evacuation of people would have begun. The deadly gas turned into an invisible haze and painted the grass white and continued to spread further. The streets of the nearby village of Machinists began to fill with the air gas mixture. A tiny flame would have been enough for a disaster. At 3 o'clock, one of the locals either switched on the porch light or lit a match to light a cigarette, after which a monstrous wave of fire swept through the village. Then huge flames shot up into the sky. It was a volumetric explosion. A huge volume of gas mixed with the air formed a bomb of enormous size and power. Several kilometers away from the village, the inhabitants saw a huge column of fire that even seemed to touch the sky. The power of the explosion was added by cars filled with gasoline and gas cylinders standing in apartment buildings. The explosion was so destructive that it destroyed an entire settlement. Everything was burned and melted. A few minutes later, almost all of Syzran's fire departments arrived on the scene. Only one fire crew remained in the city itself. Fire alarm number 3 was declared throughout the region. According to the recollections of firefighters, as they drove through the city, they saw a huge glow over the village of Mashinistov. Having set up fire hydrants, firefighters began to put out what was just beginning to flare up. It was no longer possible to put out the houses, and it was simply impossible to walk to the houses. Firefighters in special tarpaulin suits, drenched in water, could not withstand the infernal temperatures. And even some of the cars standing nearby had bubbling paint on their bodies, despite the fact that the cars were being poured with water. The crews were stationed between the burning village and the railway station, with the task of eliminating all incoming fires. There were tanks of fuel at the station at the time. If the fire had reached the tanks, the scale of the disaster would have been unpredictable. The place of the disaster was unhooked by police squads. The ambulance crews who arrived were shocked by what they saw. An air ambulance was called for the seriously injured. An endless line of ambulances drove to the burn center. The survivors did not understand what had happened. Many in a state of shock thought a nuclear war had broken out. The surviving residents of the village were transported to a collection point at the Syzran military registration and enlistment office. All were issued coupons for free meals in any canteen. The whole town responded to help. People brought food and warm clothes. Plants and organizations announced a fundraiser. More than 1,500 people came to the blood transfusion station. 3 people found themselves in the dock: the person on duty at the station, the assistant compiler of trains, and the railroad worker who left the scene of the accident. The duty officer and assistant were sentenced to 6 years in prison. The third defendant was sentenced to 3 years in a general regime penal colony. The station mastermind, after serving a year in a high-security penal colony, was transferred to a settlement colony in Tolyatti and returned to work at the railroad after being released on parole. The assistant trainmaker, having served his time, changed his profession and never returned to the railroad, and the worker who left the crash site while in prison for an unknown reason received an additional sentence. Nothing is known about his fate. Today there is a birch grove on the site of the former settlement, which was planted immediately after the fire. I thank you for watching. Your support is very important to me. Your comments and thumbs up motivate me to release new videos on interesting topics. Subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the new videos.